Hello, everyone. Welcome another week to the EBD seminar series. Today is my pleasure to introduce you Esther Sebastián González, and she's currently a Ramón y Cajal researcher at the Miguel Hernández University here in Spain. Esther did her PhD on the role of irrigation pond for waterbirds at the Miguel Hernández University, and then she investigated seed dispersal interactions at the São Paulo University in Brazil, and later at the Stanford University in the USA. During that time, she has been living in Hawaii, working in the University of Hawaii in USA too, to work with bioacoustics. And then she came back to Miguel Hernández University, where she is based now, to focus on the community ecology of scavenger assemblages. I consider her a friend and a fantastic scholar, so I hope that you enjoy her work a lot. Thank you very much, Esther, for being here.
Well, thank you very much, Agus, for the presentation and also for the invitation to be here today. It is a real pleasure for me to be able to talk to such a great audience. For me, one of the best researchers in Spain are there in the EBD. So it's a real pleasure. And just a little correction. I am not at the Miguel Hernández University anymore. Oh. I moved to the University of Alicante when I got the Ramón y Cajal Fellow. So for now, 1 year, I just made 1 year. I am at the Department of Ecology at the University of Alicante. But it's 20 kilometers away, so it's fine.
That's great.
Okay, well, what I'm gonna tell you today is I'm gonna talk to you about a study that I've been working on for the last 3 years, more or less, where I've been working with scavenger communities on a global scale. So the first thing I want to talk about is what are scavengers, what I'm working with. So basically, a scavenger is any kind of animal that eat carrion, so a dead animal. In my case, I work with vertebrate and terrestrial scavengers, which is, of course, vultures. Both vultures are obligate scavengers, which basically means that they only eat carrion or mostly eat carrion. But there are also a lot of other animals, including birds, mammals, but also even reptiles that eat carrion and are included in these studies that I've been doing about terrestrial scavengers. And the first question people ask me when I say I'm working with scavengers is, why scavengers? So let's try to go back to when we were at school and we were studying in biology class and the typical trophic network. So we have the primary consumers that being consumed by the primary producers, the plants being consumed by the primary consumers, herbivores, those consumed by carnivores, and those by top predators. And when all these animals and plants were dying, they were decomposed by the decomposer and they would go back here to the cycle, right? However, in the last years, we've been seeing that a large proportion of the carrion that it's eaten, that it's produced by herbivores, so the dead animals, the dead herbivores, are indeed not all of them decomposed through the decomposers, but a really large proportion of them are eaten by other carnivores or top predators, and that the proportion of meat that is consumed by them is much larger than that decomposed, up to 95%, more than 95% in some ecosystems. So this is really important. Okay, that happens especially with herbivores, but also some carnivore meat is consumed by other carnivores. So scavengers can be really important. And when we're talking about amount of meat that is produced, so the amount of carcasses, it can be really a lot. Only here in Spain, we have about more than 50 million of livestock heads of different types of livestock, especially pigs, but also goats, cows, and sheep. But we also get a lot of carrion from hunting activities. So this is the amount of kilograms of meat that were produced each of these years in Spain just from hunting. And hunters, they often go hunt and they take part of the meat, but very often they just take the head and some of the most tasty part of the meat and they leave the rest behind for scavengers, okay? So it's really, really a lot. So what do scavengers do? Basically, imagine this carcass in the middle of the field, dead animal for a long time. It can be a source of an infective disease, and they can transmit this disease. It could be a source of it. So if you have a scavenger that goes there and eats the carrion, you decrease a lot the time that carrion is available on the field. So it speeds up the cycling of that nutrient, but also reduces the risk of disease transmission. And there are also some studies that they say that these new links in the food web stabilize these food webs. But not only that, there are other ecosystem services in this case that are given to us by scavengers. This is a study by Morales Reyes and colleagues, where they studied the amount of CO2 and money that is saved by vultures. How did they do that? So remember the mad cow disease? Some years ago, the European Union made it compulsory to take the dead animal, the dead livestock, and take it in a truck to an incineration plant and incinerate it. This transportation and also the incineration produces a lot of CO2. And also the farmers have to pay for an insurance for this service. So they calculated the amount of CO2 emitted to the atmosphere and also the annual payments for these farmers in Spain, and they saw that the 0.1% of Spanish emissions due to transportation were due to this transportation of carcasses and also the incineration, like put all together. That's what they would be producing in CO2 terms, and also an annual pay of $50 million, which is a lot of money and a lot of CO2. However, vultures could have done that for free because vultures and also, of course, other scavengers, because that's what they do. They eat carrion. In this other study done by Natia Aguilera Alcalá and colleagues, they evaluated another aspect of scavengers. They evaluated what they call the non-material value. Basically, they went to different sources of information and they compiled information about how scavengers were used by photographers, nature photographers, by tourism-based agency, and also some outreach magazines. They give it a database, and also some scientific articles, and by how these species were perceived in Google Trends. And basically what you see, the size of the ball is how much attraction or how much attention was given a species, a scavenger species in each of these items. But you can see that, for example, for wildlife tourism, many species were producing non-material value for these people, or even material at the end, because they were attracting visitors to see these species. So they also have this kind of non-material value for the society. Oops. Okay. So far, what we know about the scavengers is first, I think there's, oh yes, sorry. So because of this, because of the importance and all the services and value that the importance for the functioning of the ecosystem, there has been a great increase in the amount of studies about the scavengers. This is up to 2015, but it's still increasing as amount of publication, number of papers for scavenging, carrion, and vulture. And so now, right now, we already know a lot of things. So first, we know that not all the scavengers are the same. For example, in this study here in Japan, they evaluated the amount on the left, the amount of times that the species was visiting a carcass, so the amount of carcasses visited, and on the right, the time that each species was spending in the carcass. So you can see that there are big differences. Some species, for example, the black bear appears in many carcasses, while down here, for example, the black kite doesn't appear very much, right? So not all the scavengers use the carcasses the same way. And we also know that the carrion is important. For example, in this study by Marcus Moleon and colleagues, they studied the size of the carcass, and they saw that the community that eats the carcass and the way that it is consumed depends a lot because of the size, depending on the size. They compare small carcasses, size of like a chicken, and then a goat-sized carcass, and then an elephant-sized carcass, right? And they saw that the community of species that were eating on these carcasses was very different. And some years ago, Nuria Selva and Miguel Fortuna published a great paper where they found that the organization of these species, this scavenger species, follows a nested pattern, which is a very pervasive pattern in ecological communities, but in a very particular way. So basically, as you see here, we have on the right, which is scavenger species, which is a node in our network. And on the left, we have carcasses that are on the field, maybe experimental carcasses or an animal that is dead, and we monitor it. So each node on the left is a carcass, and there is a connection, a link between the animal and the carcasses if that specific animal went to that carcass to forage on it, okay? So what we found was what this nested pattern is telling us is that the species that appear in carcasses, that appear in few carcasses, appear in those that are eaten also by many other species. Okay, so they follow this nested pattern. But the most interesting thing about nestedness in our system is that it is produced not by trait mate matching, like in other systems, like mutualisms, seed dispersal, or especially pollination, because you see all the carcasses are in this case the same, but because of facilitation. So let's take an example, for example, of the vulture up here. Vultures are really good looking for carcasses. They fly long distances, they have really good sight, and they find carcasses very easily. Well, some vultures, while they're finding carcasses, can be used by other species as an indicator of the presence of a carcass. They can follow it or try to see where they are going to try to find carcasses. But also what happens with vultures and other species is that some of them are really strong and can rip apart and open the skin of the ungulates, for example. While a jay, for example, will not be able to open the skin. So only if a bigger animal that has the ability to open the skin has gone to a carcass, another species that are smaller and has less strength will be able to access the inside of the carcass. So there are some facilitation processes that are driving this pattern. But the most interesting thing is that some years ago, we saw that this organization, this structure of the community also has some implications for the functioning of the scavenging, okay? So if you look at the upper plot here, we have 7 scavenger communities in Spain. And on the x-axis, you have nestedness. So the higher the value of the CNOF, the higher the nestedness of the system, the more organized the system is. And on the y-axis, we have the consumption rate, which is the amount of kilos of meat consumed per hour. So if the consumption rate is very high, that means that the competition for the carrion is very high also. So there's more competition in those communities. So as you see here, we see that there is an increase in the organization of the community when there is an increase also of the competition for the resource. However, now in the lower plot, we also looked for the amount of competitive exclusions in those systems using a log-table terra model. Basically, that means in a typical log-table terra model, competitive exclusion is a species that gets extinct because of competition. In our system, it means species that stop eating carrion in a system because of competition, right? So basically, what we saw is that while increasing the nestedness of the system, we would increase also the proportion of competitive exclusions because the system is there's more competition. However, when we reach a point after what we don't see an increase in the proportion of competitive exclusion, so there are no more species leaving the system because of competition. And we think that this is because the nestedness, the organization of the species, they profit better the carcass, and this counterbalances the increase in the consumption rate and in the competition that we saw up here. So in this study here, we use 7 points in peninsular Spain. However, up to here, most of the studies with the scavenger communities have been done on a local community, or regional community, or like in this one, on a national scale. But we know that a lot of patterns emerge when we talk about macroecological effects. For example, we know that the species richness is higher in the tropics, and this is related often with temperature, with rainfall, amount of rainfall, and even with the human impact, how impacted, humanized is a region. And not only the number of species, other things such as, for example, the way these species are organized, it also shows some macroecological or global patterns. As we've seen here, this is, for example, for pollination networks. So what I'm going to tell you today is about this study where we wanted to study global or macroecological patterns in scavenger communities in 3 senses. First one, we wanted to identify the macroecological factors affecting species richness and diversity. Then we wanted to identify the macroecological factors affecting the structure of these communities. And also at the last thing, we wanted to see which were the species or which were the characteristics of the species that had a more important role in maintaining the structure of the community. And this project led us to 3 papers and 3 little studies, which is what I'm going to tell you today. So about the species richness and scavenger species richness and diversity. So when I started this project, me and my colleagues had information about some study places in Spain, some in Africa, and a couple more, but we wanted to do something global. So the first thing I had to do is look for a lot of papers about people who had worked with the scavengers along the world and send hundreds of emails, I don't know if hundreds, but more than 100 emails to researchers that work with the scavenger ecology, asking for data, asking for a collaboration. And it was, I may say that I'm super happy with this because the people was very positive. I got information about 43 sites in 17 countries and the 5 continents, except for the Antarctica, where we didn't have any information. Here, the size of the circle is the number of species in each area. So we got really good sample size for such a macroecological scale. And what was I asking for? So what people was doing in these places, in all these communities, is to put a carcass on the field or to use a carcass that was already on the field, and then put one of these are camera traps that take a picture when they see movement. So they would record all the species that were feeding on the carcass. And we would get information about 2 things. First, the number of species that were appearing in each carcass, and also the relative abundance. So then the higher number of different individuals that we could see based on a lot of individuals. If we see many individuals in a picture, or if we see first a male and then a female, we know that there are at least 2 individuals. So the maximum number of identified different individuals. So they all had this type of information. A couple of the studies didn't have camera traps, but they were in heights from the distance, and it was like only 5 of them, and we reanalyzed everything without them, and the results were robust. So I won't talk about that. So what did we do? We analyzed these species richness and diversity with 6 variables. First, mean annual temperature seasonality, mean annual precipitation seasonality, the human footprint, which is a measure of the amount of people that lives in a place, how connected it is, what kind of use the habitat holds, all together in one index, and then the NDVI, which is a measure of productivity and biomass. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I just wanted to say that we selected this species because of something. So there are some hypotheses already that support the use of this species, these variables. Sorry. So, for example, just as an example, the first one, the productivity hypothesis, supports that there will be higher species richness and diversity in areas with more available environmental energy, and this is related with temperature and rainfall, right? So each of these variables were selected because of something. And then we also selected some covariates that are things that the variables that we know that affect the number of species and in a community, and so we include them in the models just to be sure that this was accounted for, which is the number of monitor carcasses, which is of course the sample size, spatial autocorrelation, and also carrion size because of the study I just told you. And we just use generalized linear models and using a model averaging approach. So what did we find? For diversity, only one variable was significant, and it was a covariate. It was carcass size, and it had this bit weird size where it was higher for medium-sized carcasses, the diversity. But none of the macroecological factors affected scavenger diversity. However, we found super interesting things for species richness. We found that it was higher when carcass was big and smaller when the carcass was small. We found that it was related with sample size. So when we have a higher sample size, the number of species will be higher. But the most interesting thing is that there was only one variable that was affecting the number of scavengers on a macroecological scale, and that was human footprint. And it did it in a very particular way. You have a look here. Basically, when human footprint is low, you just can't find any kind of value for number of species. However, when you increase the number of the human impact, you start only finding communities that have just few species richness or few species in the community. If you want to know more about it, this is published in Global Change Biology. And as you see, it was a really collaborative way. I had to deal with all these people, which was challenging, but it was great. Okay, the second part I wanted to tell you about is the identification of large global factors that were affecting the structure of these communities. So again, I used the same database. However, between the first paper and the second paper, something really interesting happened is that a lot of people wrote to me saying that, look, I have this data, maybe you want to use it in next papers. So we got 54 different sites. I also, with my project, did 2 fieldwork campaigns to fill some gaps, one here in Mongolia and one here in Brazil. And at the end, we had information now on 22 countries, which is great. Increase quite a lot of our sample size. And what did we have now? So now the data we are using is a little bit different. We are using the species that were eating each carcass, which species were eating each carcass, and also to calculate the network structure, and also the consumption rate, which is the kilograms of meat consumed per hour in each place. Okay. And with this information, we calculated 2 metrics of network, of nestedness, the NOF and the W0. Basically, the W0 is the weighted measure of NOF with this relative abundance, not abundance, or what we call abundance here, values. And these metrics tell you how much our community follows this perfectly nested patterns in relation to other null models that we use. So we related the nestedness and weighted nestedness again with the same variables, and again I'm using the same variables because of something. So for each variable that I'm using, there is an underlying process that we thought about, and at the end we came to the same set of variables, of course from a set that we had available, but everything that is in the model has an ecological reason. And then we included 4 covariates, 2 related with the networks, which is connectance and matrix size, and then again, spatial autocorrelation and carrion size. And we use the same approach than before. This is what we got. First, connectance affected both nestedness and weighted nestedness, and it reduced it. So when the network was more connected, the nestedness, it was less nested. And the size of the network affected also the metrics in a positive way. So when the larger matrices were more nested, which is quite known in networks in general. And also the weight of the nested of the carcasses was affected. In this case, we didn't do categories. We got to get all the actual weight of all the carcasses, so we could have a continuous variable. So larger carcasses, communities where larger carcasses were used were also more nested. But we only again found results for macroecological variables for the nestedness, not for weighted nestedness. And we found these 2 variables were affecting it. First, the NDVI. So communities that were more productive had a higher nestedness, which is normally related to the amount of species that are in these communities, or these communities can hold. That promotes also nestedness, as we saw. And then we saw again that human footprint was very important. So when communities, the human footprint of the communities was high, then they had a more random organization, let's say. Then I sent these results to my co-authors, which don't work with networks, and they say like, okay, bye. But please make us a conceptual figure about why is this happening. And I tried to do that, and this is what I got. So I'm gonna try to explain you how human impact is affecting the structure of the communities. So if you look at the left, you have your entire community with, for example, the vulture and connecting or visiting all the carcasses. On your right, you have definited community or humanized community where we have lost the vulture, as you see here. When you lose the vulture, you lose the interactions of the vulture. But again, because vulture is a good signaler, is signaling the presence of carcasses, and it's opening carcasses, there are other species that maybe are not able to consume a carcass. For example, maybe I think this represents a fox. Maybe the fox is not able to find this carcass and won't visit it anymore. So there are extra links that are lost because a species is lost in a system because of human impact. And we think that this is probably the most likely scenario that is driving this pattern. And again, as we saw in a little scale at the beginning, we related again the nestedness of the system with the consumption rate. So this is the nestedness only for, not for the weighted nestedness, only for nestedness. Related with the consumption rate, controlling for their variables, and we found that again, it looks like more nested communities also are those that are in places where the competition for the resource is stronger. And again, if you want to know more about this, it was published last year, well, 2 years ago now, in Ecography. And the last thing I had for today was to identify, okay, now we know what's going on. We know what these large patterns on a community scale, but what's going on a species scale. So what are the species, the scavenger species that are more important for maintaining this structure? So using the same database than in the previous paper, I think that we only increased one study site here. We got to a set of 177 species that had been found to scavenge somewhere, okay? For each of those communities, what we calculated is 2 network metrics: the normalized degree, which is the proportion of realized interactions, so the proportion of the interactions that each species is doing in the network, and what we call per nested degree, which is metric of how much a species contributes to the nestedness of the community, okay? We related these 2 network metrics with a set of functional traits of the scavengers that we think are important for scavenger. For example, noisiness. If species is very noisy, other species can hear it, they can maybe go and try to find the carrion. Vision and olfaction are also very good to find the carrion, because the carrion is smelly, so some individuals find it just because of the smell. Mobility among range, if the species moves a lot, is super important, and it will be more likely that it finds a carcass. Sociality, when a species is social, there is an interchange of information about individuals that can help to find the carcass. Also, if the species is a obligate or a facultative scavenger, this is what scavenging means. If it's a predator or not, if it's a carnivore or omnivore, and also the body weight. And then we use mixed models in R, using the species as a random term. And again, we use as a covariate the carrion size, but also because we know that the NDVI and human footprint had affected the nestedness of the network, we included them as a covariate in the models. So what did we find? Well, there's only one functional trait that was affecting both metrics, per nested degree and normalized degree. It was sociality. So social species, such as vultures, have a higher normalized degree and highest contribution to the nestedness. Family groups have intermediate, and solitary species had the lowest contribution and lowest degree. And then also, we saw that the scavenging degree was very important. So it's obligate scavengers have a higher normalized degree than facultative scavengers, and also species that had a high olfaction, that could smell very well, have a higher normalized degree than those that didn't have the smelling capacity. And we didn't find any other variables for the contribution to nestedness. And again, if you're interested, and this got published now, yes, last year, 2021, in Ecology. So to wrap up, 3 papers, 3 take-home messages that I would like you to remember. First, that the scavenger species richness was low where human impact was high, that the structure of these communities, of scavenger communities, was affected by human impact and by NDVI, and also that more nested communities show higher carrion consumption rates, so they are in places where the competition for the carrion is higher. And also finally, that the species that have a more important role for maintaining the network structure are those that are obligate scavengers, social species, and also species that have a good olfaction. With that, I would like to finish. I would like to thank first the Generalitat Valenciana for funding me for these last 3 years. And I cannot thank enough all the people that has agreed to work with me, has collaborated with me within this project. But also, I think I was a bit afraid at the beginning of working with so many people and how it would go. And at the end, everybody was really constructive, very positive. Everybody worked a lot. And I think I'm super, super happy of how this collaboration went. Indeed, we had what we call like a 4th chapter coming out somewhere sometime this year or next year. Of course, thank you everybody for seeing me today. And I'm here if you have any question. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you to you. Thank you, Esther. Thank you very much for this amazing talk. Let's see if there are new questions in the chat.
If not, I can perhaps warm up the virtual room a little bit. So yeah, thanks so much, Esther. I mean, it's always really, I mean, I'm always blown away by these scavenger talks. It's definitely a system that I'm not so familiar with. So I was wondering about how you measured the human footprint or the human impact, because I can imagine that's very different, especially on a global scale. And even I think, I mean, the vulture guys here at EBD, they're always saying that, you know, there's huge differences between Spain and Portugal, for example, in the way countries manage carcasses. So how did you measure that?
Yeah, well, management is not included in this variable. I was happy to find this variable. It is indeed a variable. A super good group of researchers made it. There is a paper about it. So it's just shape file that is available to everybody who wants to use it, and it's open. So basically, it's the people who made this human footprint metric, they put together information about human density, connectivity, so the amount of roads, rivers, ports that had any area. I think it was also habitat use, so it was if it's agriculture, if it is a city, or if it is a natural park, and they put all these data shapes together. They gave them a different weight depending on different factors, and they made like a variable, which is unified and that you can just use and measure an overall human footprint or human impact in an area. Of course, it doesn't have everything. There are a lot of things that are not included, such as management, which is super important for scavengers. For example, some colleagues, in Ecuador, some colleagues, they published this paper where vultures were not going to Portugal, they were staying in the Spanish part, right, because of management. So we couldn't account for that because that's super different in every country, and we just didn't have information to do that. But this is this variable, which is available, is a good metric of an overall human impact in an area.
Okay, great, thanks. So now there's definitely some questions in the chat, so I'll relay those. So Montevilla here from EBD is thanking you for the very interesting talk. And she's asking whether species richness can be compensated by species abundance.
Yes,
so
that's a great question. We think it can compensate species abundance in some communities. Depends, of course, on. So if you lose a vulture in these communities, which is super efficient, we see a release on the mesopredators, for example, very often. So they increase because there is more food for them, and they account for part of the food, so they eat more of the carrion available. But depending on who is increasing, you can compensate for the loss of a species or not. This is something I've always wanted to address. It's impossible at this scale because we don't have information. So we don't have independent information on the abundance of all the species, the 177 species in each country. This is like impossible to get for some areas. But we are starting to do some more local studies where we have independent information on the abundance of different species and see how this abundance in the area affects the scavenging and what happens if you lose one species, if the other species increases, you know. But so the short response is yes, it definitely affects it. We don't have the data.
All right. So before I move on to so Miguel Fortuna, also here from EBD, has a question, but there was a sort of a related question from Montse again. So she's asking, what about insects? What role do insects play in this network?
Yeah, that's also something super interesting. So in most of these systems, when you have vertebrates and they are in enough abundance and they find the carrion, they find it so fast that the amount of meat that invertebrates eat is really small in general. So in most of these places, the amount of meat that invertebrates eat is very small. However, especially when you have a carcass in summer or in areas where there are not many scavengers, or sometimes you have a carcass and they just don't find it soon enough, then invertebrates go there and eat the carcass. It takes longer for them, of course, but then they are super important for this second part of the composition, or well, it's not a composition, it's recycling by the invertebrates. So they can be important in some situations. They are more important for carnivore carcasses. So if instead of having an herbivore, you have a carnivore, there is this whole entire story about these carcasses, but then you have a high proportion of invertebrates eating the carcass. And also in summer, I mean, depends on several factors. However, the amount of meat overall that they consume is not that much compared with that consumed by vertebrates.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, definitely a really complex system. Okay, so I have some a very specific question, I think, from Miguel Fortuna. It's about your network analysis. So first of all, he thanks you for your talk, and he's asking, if I'm not wrong, you use the raw values of node F to characterize the nested structure of scavenger communities. But since this value depends on network size and connectance, as you've shown, you need to standardize node F values to compare across networks. That is, you need to quantify how much the nestedness of each network departs from the expected value given a network with a particular size and connectedness.
Yes, he's totally right, and I did standardize my nestedness metrics. I didn't tell about it. So in the study at the beginning, I was telling, so with only 7 sites, we use a C value. So that's the value, the value of our network minus the mean divided by the standard deviation. But later I read a bit that it's probably the standard deviation can affect a bit the way you standardize it, and it was better to do a different way. So in the other papers, what I use is the value minus the mean divided by the value, by the mean. Sorry. So it is standardized. But it's still, we have a little effect, much smaller, but it still have an effect of the connectance and the matrix size, even after standardizing.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I mean, he I don't know if he suggested or he asked if you used a null model to take into account these factors, so network size, connectance, as. But yeah, I have to say I'm not an expert on networks, so I'm not sure if I'm.
Yes, I use so I basically compare the structure of my network with the structure of 1,000 networks built using a null model. That basically, so it depends on, because I have a weighted or not weighted metrics, but basically you have a null model where you have the same number of species and you have the same proportion of interactions in the columns and the rows.
Okay, makes sense. Okay, so another question, this time from Irene Mendoza. So she says, thanks, obviously, for the interesting talk. And she would like to get a better handle on the relationship between the nestedness and competition. So could there be facilitation? So for instance, some scavenger species go first and only then others go later. So I think you touched on it a little bit, right?
That's exactly what's going on. What we think is going on. I mean, we kind of demonstrated, but what we see is that for example, you have very often that the first one that arrives to a carcass is a vulture, because it finds very often. We have this paper coming out soon, I hope, where we see that the species, the vultures that can smell in Brazil are the first one that arrive to the carcass, and then other vultures that cannot smell follow them and find the carcass after. So there's this facilitation that maybe the other vulture that has not the ability to smell is not able to find a small carcass in the middle of the forest. But if you have the other one signaling you where the carcass is, then you can follow it and then enter and take use of the carcass. That's one of the facilitations. And the other one is the one I was telling you about. It's important for especially for the large carcasses. Some individuals, some species cannot open the skin because it's very hard. So you have another species that have it's more powerful, has hard beaks or hard paws, and they can open. Then other species will be able to access to the meat. If not, there's no these other species before coming and opening the carcass, they just won't be able to use it. So yes, I think that's why we have find this nested pattern, because you have an order in the entrance of the carcass. If this other species doesn't arrive first, then the other one won't be able to use it.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah. So like I said, I really don't know very much about scavengers at all. I work mostly with amphibians and reptiles, and it's always been curious to me why scavengers tend to be birds and mammals. I don't know, but maybe I'm just not very informed. Is there some?
Sorry, yes. There are some reptiles. We found some reptiles eating carrion. Especially, we saw a couple of them in Brazil. Why they are not using them in other places, I'm not sure. We have really few species. I think in total we found, I'm not sure, between 5 and 7. I'm not totally sure. Reptiles making use of the carcasses. But yeah, there are really few of them, but there are some. I mean, it's interesting to see that there are still some reptiles using it and making use. Mm-hmm.
No, I think that one reason could be that the insects that surround the carcasses might be even more attractive to the reptiles than the carcasses itself, because it's already moving around. So and giving it a lot of food that it can easily detect, you know.
Yeah, indeed, we've seen many reptiles going around the carcass eating the insects, or even birds eating the insects and not the carcass. So going to the carcass to eat the insects that are there. So of course there are also, but we would say something like a secondary users of the carcass, which are those animals that use the carcass, the invertebrates that are in the carcass for eating, or we've even seen animals going to the carcass and taking some hairs, for example, for the nest, some birds taking the hair for the nest. So there are some secondary uses besides scavenging that we've seen in the images when we were doing the field work.
That's great. I have myself a question. Like we are now seeing a lot of appearing in the news. People like how you say, people that take care of cattle that are spreading over large areas. And what would you given your results and given your discoveries, would you give some main instructions or hints in order to promote the conservation of scavenger communities in areas that have, well, at least some degree of human footprint? Like, will there be from these results some advices that you could give to people to promote the, well, healthier scavenger communities that they can?
That's very interesting, because indeed, when you see, so we are also doing, I mean, not myself, but people I work with and are doing interviews to farmers to see their perception of scavengers. And very often when you talk to people that is really on the field, that lives close to the field, close to the animals, or for example, remember in Mongolia, the Sherpas that were there all the day with the animals, they had a super positive view of the scavengers. So they already knew that they were good because they have seen them eating the dead animals. So they had this animal that was dead, and the next day there were a lot of vultures, and then it was gone. So they didn't have that dead animal smelling and they're close to them. So indeed, they know it is good. When we see that people doesn't perceive scavengers as good, it's more often when you talk to people that has like a big livestock farms, intensive farms, that they don't see anything. They don't see any value to them because they have just this huge place, and vultures are maybe around there, they are disturbing. So when you really are in the field and you see like more sustainable exploitation, such as extensive farming, in general, they appreciate the value of the vultures. But of course, not always. Some of them are not like that. What would I say? I would say that vultures are doing the job of, for example, taking the animals to the incineration plants and burning them. So they would save them money, and they would just eliminate sources of smell or maybe infective disease transmission. So at the end, vultures and scavengers in general are good for these extensive farms, for sure.
But what was bugging me a little bit more is would it be advisable to give them, for example, hints on locating all the carcasses in the same place, so you have a big area that can attract a large number of scavengers at the same time, or better to distribute them in small spots, things like that? I don't know.
Yeah, that's also another large issue in scavenger ecology. Ainara Cortez Abizonda, she has some cool papers about it, where she compares how is it scavenging when you put all the carcasses together, like in restaurants are called, like when you put all the carcasses together, or when you separate them. And what you see when they put them together, you see that carcasses are monopolized by vultures. So they're mostly eaten by vultures and no one else can get there. Well, if you separate them, other species can access those carcasses because they are more unpredictable. And that helps other species to be able to arrive. So I cannot say put them all together and put them all separated. I guess a combination of both is good. Yeah, I have not worked with that personally, but that's what I've read.
Okay. Thank you very much. Do we have any other? I think that Irene might have something else about the reptiles, Chris.
Yeah. So what? Again, pondering about why there's generally fewer reptiles or amphibians that eat carrion, and she ponders whether it might be something related to the immune system.
To the what?
To the immune system. So I guess scavengers have quite robust immune systems, right?
Well, vultures do have it. I mean, they are prepared to eat dead animals, so they have a very powerful immune system, I guess. But I don't know about, maybe you guys know better than me if the immune system of the reptiles is weaker. I really don't know. That's something that it's always, well, I've always wondered why, but I've never got to an answer. I mean, I don't think, if someone knows about it, please let me know. But I just have not seen many of them. So yeah.
I can imagine amphibians being a little bit more of danger of approaching also because these are also, you know, prey of the other larger scavengers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is linked to another question that I was also it also struck me a lot. The differences in time of using the carrion. Do you think, or has been any study that showing where there is a relationship between the time in carrion usage and the position level in the position in trophic levels, like top predators, for example, animals that are not being predated by anybody, spending more time, and animals from the lower levels spending very little time, just reaching to get a little, you know.
Well, not exactly the way you have said it. So it's not, I cannot remember right now. I studied relating the time with the trophic level, but there are a couple of papers where you can see very well how is the separation in time, the time division when consuming. You see for example, the eagle arriving and then no one else is there. And when the eagle leaves, I think it was with crows, the crows would come, and the crows would only come to the carcass when the eagle is not active because of the time of the day. So there is for sure a separation in the use of the resource. And species that are, so this is what we call the landscape of fear, right? Also affects a lot the consumption of the carcass. There is a new study line about it that's leading Marcos Moleon about how this fear is going to affect the consumption of the carcass in areas where there are top predators, or in areas where there are not top predators that could predate on the scavenger. There's a lot of new things coming soon for sure. But yes, it's affecting the way it is used, the way the carcass is used.
It's a very super interesting system, Esther. Okay, do we have any more questions? That's it. All right. Well, I want to thank you again, Esther. Thank you very much for your super informative talk on this system that is super. I mean, it's something that we have always seen around from our childhood, right? As a biologist, and you know, the vulture, something. But then the system seems to have so many open questions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to teach us about this. Do you want to have any last words? Not before that.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you for everybody for the nice words and for the questions. And again, thank you guys for inviting me and to be able to share my research with you. And I hope you like it. And of course, if you have any other questions, you can contact me. I left my email there. Feel free to email me. And yes, thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Esther. People is still congratulating you for the talk. Okay, well, thanks everybody. Thanks, Chris, for helping us with the questions. And see you next week, next Thursday on the next seminars. Bye-bye, everybody.